Today I am going to introduce myself a little bit more. I'm going to introduce you to some of the dressmakers. You can see their images here. And I'm also going to be showing you some interesting garments and documents from my archives, because I've been collecting for over 20 years now. So I'm a clothes historian. And it's a very interesting and utterly absorbing way of looking at history. And yes, it's looking at actual garments, and the garments themselves can tell us so much about culture, about technology, about trade, about exploration, about the whole of human life. But clothes themselves also hold stories, and they hold memories too. So they've long fascinated me. So I'm going to explain a little bit more about why I think clothes history is so important. But first, I was thinking about California. I first came to California in the early 1990s, and I was visiting a friend in Long Beach, if you know Long Beach. And it was here that we went to vintage fairs, because I always liked collecting, although I couldn't afford to buy a lot in those days. We went to the Museum of Tolerance, which had just opened, which was fascinating. And I stayed with my friend in Long Beach, and she was a friend from university. We'd met at Cambridge University, where I was studying literature. And I was specializing on what was called the literature of atrocity. So how people respond to atrocity, and I was focusing on the Holocaust, but also the fragments that those who endured the Holocaust or those who perished, the fragments that they left behind. So instead of looking at grand printed works of art from the ancient Greeks on tragedy, I was looking at how little scraps of paper and little discarded photographs had held so many memories and so much resonance. So I went to stay with my friend in Long Beach, and I remember very distinctly going into their best room, which in England we would call the living room. And in the room, there were so many photographs, black and white family photographs. And as a clothes historian, I'm already interested in clothes at this time. And I'm dating the photographs through the clothes. And they date back, they were mainly from the 1890s onwards until the 1930s. And then the black and white photos stopped. And so my friend introduced me to some of her family history, about how some of her family, they were all Jewish from Eastern Europe. Some escaped Europe. Some fled to Holland thinking they would be safe. They were not. And so these photographs, to me, they bridged that, they made a connection between an interest in history and the clothes people wore, and also this interest in the literature of atrocity. And I simply could not understand, and I still can't. How could people who grew up in the 1890s think of all those fabulous 19th century clothes? How could they enter the modern world, the 20th century? And then how could they meet such a brutal end? Mass murder. And many of them perished in Auschwitz. So over the last more than 20 years, I've been following these two interests. And much of my work it's so enjoyable to meet people, to hear their stories, to interview them, and also to work with clothes. And I'll just tell you a bit about the blouse I'm wearing. It's actually a replica. It's made from a Vogue pattern of the 1940s, and a lovely colleague of mine made it, because I can't sew. And so it's made from an original 1940s pattern, but we upcycled a vintage dressing gown to make it, very much in the spirit of the 1940s. And I grew up with very lovely memories of my grandmother's sewing. And so I brought a family sewing machine here. I just remember her sitting and her foot working the treadle, and I would be on the floor picking up pins and playing with bits and bobs and sewing notions. And here's my grandmother's tape measure. So she was a professional dressmaker. And many of you may have family members who worked in dressmaking or millinery or tailoring, or perhaps just people at home. It's often women at home, isn't it, who make clothes for the family, or who are knitting, or who are mending. And these skills are often overlooked in history. But I've been very pleased to have focused my attention for the last few years on dressmaking. Now, the other link with California for tonight is really strong also, because at least two of the dressmakers from the fashion salon at Auschwitz found a home and a safe haven in California after the war. And as well as these two dressmakers, a very important Holocaust scholar, Dr. Laura Shelley, moved with her husband to San Francisco. And she dedicated much of her academic life. She was a survivor of Auschwitz and was actually in the same accommodations as the dressmakers. She dedicated much of her academic life to collecting testimonies. She says, you know, it's never too late to share your story. And it's thanks to Dr. Shelley that we know anything at all about this infamous fashion salon established by the commandant's wife. In 1981, at the World Jewish Congress, she sent out questionnaires asking for people's experiences of pre-war life and camp life and so on. And she also asked for people's testimonies. And in the archives, Dr. Shelley's archives at the Tauber Holocaust Library in San Francisco, there are boxes and boxes and boxes of files. And inside you can read aerograms and typewritten testimonies and little scribbled telephone notes. And you can read Dr. Shelley's correspondence with so many people around the world. And it was here that I eventually went to discover more about these remarkable women. But California has another link, because the last surviving dressmaker of the Auschwitz salon, she for many years lived with her husband and her family in the San Francisco area. And I was fortunate enough to go and visit her and to spend time with her and her family and interview her. Because although there are archives to search and there are many video and oral testimonies, to speak with someone who remembers is utterly invaluable. And that's me talking as a historian, but as a human being, to be able to connect like that, to be able to spend time and to remember that history is not just theory, it is people's lives. And so the emotional impact of that was really important and really powerful. So there's the California link. I have very lovely memories of visiting California. Now, my whole interest in clothing history has taken me many different eras. My collection dates back to the 17th century. And along the way, I've returned time and again to the 1940s and to the era of the Second World War, researching women's lives around the world. And it was during these years of research that I came across a snippet of Dr. Shelley's scholarly collection and a mention of the Upper Tailoring Studio. And like you most likely are, I was just staggered at this idea that you could have a fashion salon. And if you think what a fashion salon conjures up, gleaming sewing machines and the mannequins and beautiful fabrics and clients having their fittings and fashion magazines, you conjure that image up. And then it's in Auschwitz. It's in a place that is synonymous with hell. It's in a notorious Nazi extermination camp. How on earth is that grotesque anomaly possible? And when I first came across mention of this, I just couldn't find out any further information at the time. And there were a list of names, and some of them were just nicknames. So the names were Marta, Bracha, Katka, Lulu, Mimi, Mansi, Baba, Borishka. And how do you track down nicknames and pet names and first names? And it's quite difficult with women's history in particular to trace their names in archives because, of course, women marry and change their name. They may change it when they're widowed. Many of the women actually, I discovered, changed their names from a European name to a Hebrew name as well. So it was really hard to think, how on earth can I start? And it was actually through a story that I was able to make contact. So I write young adult fiction, and with what little I knew of the Upper Tailoring Studio, I created an entirely fictional story, but hopefully having resonance, and it was called The Red Ribbon. And so here is the American edition. And in this book, I wanted to try and imagine what would it be like to be a young prisoner who had to sew to save their life. It is such an extraordinary concept. So the book is fiction, and I appreciate that Holocaust fiction has its issues, but always creatives want to respond to world events, to trauma. And also, I thought there was no way that we could find out anything else. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the state museum, they said there were no records left of the place. The Nazis destroyed so much when the camp was evacuated. They started burning documents in late 1944 and continued right up until they left. So no documentary evidence specifically about the salon. But when the novel was published, thanks to the miracle of the internet, I was contacted by people who knew the names that I'd mentioned. I'd been interviewed, and I said, you know, we don't know who these women are, Marta and Hunya and Bracha and Rene. But the emails arrived, and they said, well, Marta was my grandmother. She ran the fashion salon in Auschwitz. Or Irina is my mother. She was one of the dressmakers. And eventually I had contact with a lovely woman in Israel who said, well, you do realize that Bracha, one of the dressmakers, is still alive. She's in San Francisco, 98 years old, bright as anything. So I contacted her family and said, may I please come and speak with you? So let me introduce you now to some of these women whose stories, thanks to families getting in touch with me, I was able to uncover more of. Because when you've got names, you can really start going into the archives. Obviously, Yad Vashem, the Wiener Holocaust Library in London, United States Holocaust Museum. And I had the chance finally to fly to San Francisco and look at Dr. Shelley's archives, which was an extraordinary experience to see written communications from people that you maybe think of, you know, it's history, it's theory. No, these women seem very real to me. I felt very familiar with them and felt a lot of compassion and a lot of anger as I wrote about their lives. So take a look. And here, this is Marta. So Marta Fuchs was 25 years old when she was deported, and she became head of the fashion salon in Auschwitz. And here is Renee, a young girl, a rabbi's daughter. Here is Irina Reichenberg. Here is Irina's best friend, Bracha's sister, Katka, and a fabulous spirited woman called Hunya. You read all of their stories, their childhoods, their teenage years, and so on in the book. All of these young women were based in Slovakia, or born in Slovakia. Marta originally was born in an area that's now part of Hungary, but she moved to Bratislava. So they all had these wonderful links in the community, the Jewish community in Bratislava, and particularly Irina and Rane and Bracha. They were all friends together on Żydowska Street, or Judengasse, the Jewish street in Bratislava. And then Hunya was born in Slovakia, but she moved to Leipzig. So here are a core of women, but from my research, it seems that there were roughly 20 to 25 women in the main salon, but up to 40 women passed through its doors. And today, because of the California link, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Bracha. I hope you can see her. There are many photos in the book. And Bracha is pictured here with her sister Katka. Their father was a tailor. Their mother and father together ran a very, very smart tailoring business in Bratislava. And there are lovely family photographs showing the men in the family wearing splendid tailored clothes. And Katka here, She was learning the tailoring trade from her father, as so often happens, passed on parents to children, passing on the skills. Bracha wasn't so interested in sewing, but she did love clothes. And one of the stories that Bracha told to me when I went to visit her was, as a young girl, she was going to her uncle's wedding. And she had a miracle of miracles, a shop-bought dress. So not homemade. They had no money, this family, but they'd actually managed to get together money for a new dress for Bracha to wear to the wedding. And she wanted to copy her father, the tailor. So she took out the ironing board and the iron and began to iron the dress. You can imagine what happens next. There's the smell of scorching fabric, and she's burnt it. And she had to wear an old dress to the wedding. And I tell you this story because clothes often stay in our mind as they fix memories. You might have a memory of clothes you wore when you were little, or things that adults wore around you. Or if you keep clothes, you can take them out and remember people who are perhaps long gone. But the memory is also important because not so many years later, there was a very different ironing situation. And Bracha here, she recounted how, as a young woman, only 22 years old, she was in the fashion salon at Auschwitz, and one of the young dressmakers there was ironing a dress. Not for herself, not for a wedding, for an SS client. And as she was ironing, the same catastrophe. She burnt the dress. And this wasn't simply a question of, oh no, I've ruined a dress. The dressmaking salon in Auschwitz was a haven. Beyond that, there was only hard labor, brutality, and the gas chambers. So to anger an SS client was a terrifying prospect, and the client herself was due for a fitting the next day. Luckily, the prisoner, the inmate in charge of the dressmaking salon, was Marta, a very clever, very compassionate woman who used her position not only to save the lives of friends and family and anyone she felt she could help by drawing them into the salon, but she also looked out for all of the girls and women under her charge. So she very quickly, when she smelt the burning fabric, said, right, what we're going to do is we're going to take this bit of fabric out here, we're going to put another insert in, we'll fix it up. And when the SS woman came in the next day, she tried on the dress, looked in the mirror and said, I don't remember it being like this. And Marta said, no, this is just how we designed it. It's the latest fashion, looks wonderful. So I tell you these two stories just to give you a very humanizing sense of clothing and also what was at stake for these young women sewing for the SS in Auschwitz. But perhaps I need to set the scene a little bit more about how on earth could a fashion salon be established in Auschwitz? And that means looking at the wider context of the Third Reich and greed. Because greed, plunder, and profiteering are absolutely core to so many Nazi policies and Nazi decisions. And these wider policies and this greed within the industry, it has a very real impact on people's lives. So in terms of context, I mentioned Hunya. This is Hunya here, a very stylish woman in 1934. And in 1934, she was living in Leipzig in Germany. She set up her own salon, very smart indeed, and she dressed Jews and non-Jews in Leipzig. But as you can imagine, in the 1930s in Germany, as a Jew, Hunya was all too aware of the growing escalation of persecution against Jewish people in Germany. And so she would have been aware of the boycott, the supposedly spontaneous boycott of Jewish businesses that was actually organized by the Nazis. And she would be aware of the signs saying, don't buy from Jews. And this affected her business eventually, as some people became uncomfortable or cautious. They didn't want to anger the brown shirts. So Hunya was aware of growing troubles, the Nuremberg laws in 1935 that stripped all Jewish Germans of their citizenship, And then, of course, the escalation of violence that we see culminating in Kristallnacht in November 1938, which Hunya experienced and witnessed. And I want you to imagine someone like Hunya or anyone living in Germany as a dressmaker, as a tailor, and the impact on their lives. And to do that, I'll show you a dress from my suitcase. And it perhaps gives you an idea of why I think clothes are so interesting as a way to connect with the past, but to give insights about the past. Now, I don't know how Zoom is showing the colour on this. What do you think? It should look apple green. So it's an apple green crepe dress, just as a day dress. So imagine that with a sweater or with nice sandals on a hot day. I'm sure it's hotter in California than it is in the north of England right now. And this dress, the style, dates it to the late 1930s, which of course we're already thinking has quite a context. And we know the dress is German. And I'll tell you why we know this in a moment. But we can also tell that this dress it's not from a particularly flamboyant culture, or at least it gives hints that the economy is not doing very well because it's very skimpy on fabric. It's got a really narrow rolled hem, narrow seams, minimal decoration. It's quite skimpy. And of course, we know in Germany in the 1930s that resources, everything is being diverted into rearmament and into military action, into invasions and annexations, the rebuilding of Germany as a military machine. And so for civilians in Germany, resources are quite tight, unless you are one of the privileged, one of the elite Nazis, or one of the very, very wealthy business Nazis. And this dress, although it looks very pretty and very nice, we know it's German because of the label. And I'm going to hold the label up. Hopefully, you might be able to read it. Let me get some light on that. How's that? So can you see that? It reads Adefa, A-D-E-F-A. And Adefa in English is a federation of German, Aryan clothing manufacturers. So Adefa was established by a group of businessmen in Berlin a few weeks after Adolf Hitler came to power in April 1933. So right at the start of this regime, these people, they meant business, and they were very closely allied with government policies of discrimination and anti-Semitism. So what does Adefa do? Well, the clue is in the phrase German Aryan. What's Aryan? Well, as you probably know, Aryan is a term that was co-opted by the Nazis and heavily used and emphasized by them to mean not Jewish, part of their racial structure of talking about world populations. And they specifically put the word Aryan in to mean German, to become synonymous with German, meaning Jews are not German. So this is part of the process of dehumanizing and discriminating. And Adefa's aim was to eliminate all Jews from the garment and textile trade. And this is no mean feat, because the garment and textile trade in Germany is absolutely vibrant with Jewish capital and Jewish talent. And we're talking not only the factory owners and the grand capitalists, not only the department store owners, but also the boutique owners and the salon owners and the haberdashers and the tailors sitting cross-legged at their workshops and the dressmakers with their whirring machines. So a huge amount, like I say, of Jewish capital and Jewish talent. Adefa and other groups like them wanted the entire industry for themselves. It was greed, absolute greed. They weren't content for competition. They wanted to steal the business and to erase all Jewish involvement. And they did this, as I say, with complete support of the government through vile propaganda, very powerful propaganda, demonizing Jewish people, but also through appealing to German consumers, the shoppers of Germany. They said, Germans should buy only German goods. And by German, they meant Aryan. And so shoppers were under pressure to buy from brands such as Adefa. And I think it's really interesting to wonder, what would it have been like for shoppers? Do you think they went into shops and deliberately sought out Adefa? Haha, I don't want any Jewish involvement with my clothes, that type of mentality. And yet we also know there were people who resisted the Nazi propaganda and who said, no, I have always shopped at my favorite shop that's run by Jews. I'm not going to stop now. So lots of very interesting dynamics. But I did mention the elite of the Nazi era. And here is where I have to talk about a woman named Hedwig Höss. Hedwig Höss married Rudolf Höss in 1929. And both of them were part of a very racist group called the Arteman Society, which essentially said we should all go back to honest labor on the land and Germany for German people, the folk, not Jewish. And eventually they moved from the Arteman Society because Rudolf Höss became well acquainted with Heinrich Himmler. And Heinrich Himmler encouraged Rudolf Höss to join the SS. And in this capacity, Rudolf first went to work at Dachau concentration camp, the very first one set up by the Nazis, and then to Sachsenhausen. And then in 1940, Rudolf Höss became the first commandant of Auschwitz concentration camp in occupied Poland. And all the way through, Hedwig went with him, with an ever-increasing family. And right from the first, her and other families like hers, they were used to exploiting prisoner labor. So she had prisoners working for her, as did Heinrich Himmler's wife. She also was quite used to Dachau prisoners coming to work at her house and looking after things and so on. So already there was a sense in the 1930s of you can get Jewish prisoners to work for you, and you can get your hands on Jewish businesses. And this process became even more consolidated under practices called Aryanization, which basically means turning something Aryan. Well, actually, it means stealing Jewish businesses. And this happened not only in Germany, but also fascist countries that were allied with Germany. And so in Slovakia, these young women all suffered the effects of Aryanization. Marta was running a salon in Bratislava. Nope, verboten. Irina, her father was a shoemaker, but he was told, no, Jews can't have businesses. And suddenly he has no means of earning a living. And also Brache and Katka's father, very talented tailor, he's told, no, you can't have a business. Aryans are going to run your business. And so in Germany, in Slovakia, and all the countries tainted by the Third Reich, Jews are told, you can't own businesses, you can't earn a living. What are they going to do? Terrifying situation and humiliating. And it's all greed. It was greed from the people who wanted to get their hands on the shoemaking businesses and the tailoring enterprises and the salons. Interestingly, Irina at this time in Slovakia, when she was kicked out of school for being Jewish, she said, well, we stood there in the street and we did not know what to do next, where to go. She said, on the spur of the moment, I decided to learn to sew a little. It's a fateful decision. For many women in the mid-20th century in the global north, sewing was very much part of their upbringing as a young girl. But not every family pushed the girls towards sewing. Some of them were perhaps undertaking secretarial courses or going into teaching, something more bookish. And so Brache also was like, well, what am I going to do? I've been thrown out of my education too. And they eventually found a teacher these younger girls, who would teach them in secret sewing skills. So we see this process of Aryanization and intimidation and bullying. And where possible, of course, Jewish people hope to find refuge in safer countries, many of them coming to America where possible. And certainly Hunya and Marta struggled to get visas anywhere. They would have gone to any country. And by the time they managed to get visas for countries in South America, the rules had changed. The Germans didn't want Jewish people to leave. They wanted them to stay. You might think, well, why? They wanted Germany to be Judenfrei, Jew-free. But by the late 1930s, Germany was finding it had a skills shortage. Having so brutally ejected Jewish people from their livelihoods and businesses, the Germans were now finding they didn't have enough people to work. And so their answer was, with gross hypocrisy, to use Jewish people. And as you probably know, there were hundreds and hundreds of factories of forced laborers established, not only in concentration camps, but also in ghettos and ghettoized areas. And you can read about them in the book, the profits that the rulers of the ghetto made, absolutely staggering. And it's also interesting to notice that the elite women, some of them would order clothes from the ghetto. So they were already thinking, we can get Jewish laborers. And also some of the ghettos, particularly in occupied Poland, they were actually creating everyday garments, dresses and coats and underwear and children's clothes to be shipped back to Germany for the civilian clothing market. So having said, don't buy from Jews, don't touch anything that's been made by Jews, the Germans are now secretly running ghetto enterprises using Jewish labor. And the wages, of course, are derisory. Bread, not to be knocked when you're starving. And then also, most precious of all, the right to life. So the more you can work, you hope that you will be valuable to the Nazis. So already you're seeing such stark links between the clothing trade and brutality, discrimination against Jewish people in Europe. And it gets worse. So by 1942, time has run out for these young women in Slovakia, and the pro-fascist government essentially sell young Jewish women to the Germans. They say, you can have these number of women as workers. And so in March and April 1942, these young women are rounded up and deported. And they assume that they're going to a work camp. They've been told they're going to a labor camp. And they think, well, we'll pack a suitcase. And you have to imagine, say, a suitcase like this. It's all you can take. They pack it with all their most sensible belongings. It's very cold that time of year. And they also pack a few mementos from home, bits and bobs, things they need. And instead of taking a regular train, they're put in cattle wagons. And this is where the process of dehumanization begins. And these young women featured here, along with several thousand others, are on the first official Jewish transports into Auschwitz, the Eichmann transports. And when they arrive in Auschwitz, they're the first female transports at that time arriving. One comes from Ravensbrück, but the rest are all young single women from Slovakia. And their arrival, you can read about in the book, how it feels for Bracha and Katka, the sisters clinging together, and how terrifying it is, particularly for the younger women. This process of dehumanization on arrival very much involves clothes. So you have the SS guards, suited, booted, looking incredibly smart and clean and powerful. The Nazis definitely knew how to use clothes to show status and belonging. But if you don't belong to that group, you're other. And they deliberately used clothes to dehumanize people. So use clothes, stripping. And so these young women brought up to have modesty and dignity and the right to their own bodies, suddenly being shouted at, screamed at, strip off everything. And I do write about this experience for the women, not only to have their own clothes taken away, something that maybe links them with home, but also to have their dignity, their modesty taken away, and then their identity completely shaved. They have their names taken and a number tattooed on. And this is not a coincidence. They could have kept their clothes at a regular work camp. This was deliberately turning them in the eyes of the SS from young women, all individuals with their hopes and fears and vices and virtues, into vermin, subhuman workers. And it's done through clothes. And then they're given cast-off Russian POW uniforms, filthy, riddled with lice, and some with bullet holes. And so suddenly they're transformed. And it's a remarkable thing how much clothes help you, give you a sense of confidence or identity. And without them, how do you hold on to that, particularly when you're being treated so brutally? And at the same time as these young women are arriving, just over the wall from Auschwitz main camp, there is a beautiful garden filled with young flowers and trees, and it's got a swimming pool and a pergola and a picnic table, slide for the children, and flowers everywhere coming up in spring, and a beautiful house. And this is the commandant's house. So here lives Rudolf and Hedwig and their children. Quite a lot of children by this stage. The family is growing, and Hedwig needs help. Right from the first, Hedwig uses prisoner labor from Auschwitz to come and create her beautiful garden. And she loves her house and garden so much she calls it paradise. Everything is stolen. The house has been stolen from its rightful Polish owner. The furniture is all stolen from plunder warehouses, from looted Poles and Polish Jews, all stolen. The soft furnishings, the whole contents, the artwork, even food in the kitchen is stolen from Auschwitz camp. And Hedwig herself loves to plunder clothes. So where are these clothes coming from? Well, Bracha here, when she first arrived at Auschwitz with her sister on a transport from Slovakia, she had her one suitcase. And as she jumped down from the train, it was quite a high jump, she looked back, she helped Katka down, Katka was very frail, and she looked back and she couldn't reach her suitcase. And she was worried about it. And the SS man at the station said, "Don't worry, we'll take care of your luggage." Oh boy, did they take care of the luggage. Because Auschwitz at this stage was a vast profit-making enterprise for the SS. One reason that Heinrich Himmler had been so heavily involved in the establishment was to run lots of enterprises. There was IG Farben, the Buna works, the big rubber works. There were mass agricultural works. There were construction sites. And this hard labor was all to be done by prisoners to the profit of the SS. But the luggage comes into it because the SS plundered every single thing that deportees brought to the camp. And this is the same in every single labor camp, concentration camp and extermination center. The luggage was initially taken to a group of warehouses in the main camp called Canada. And here, very lucky prisoners, amongst them, a lot of the new Slovakian arrivals, they were put to work sorting through the suitcases. And they had to sort piles of jewelry, piles of money, piles of photographs. The photographs were considered not valuable, burned. And they also sorted the clothes. And the clothing was sorted into bundles of different types of clothes. So trains would come in with people and they would leave with clothes. And these clothes and shoes and everything, all the plunder, was sent back to Germany. And it was distributed to German civilians via the Red Cross, via the Frauenschaft, the women's organization. So they were absolutely profiteering from plunder. And Hedwig herself had special envoys, prisoners, that she would send to the plunder warehouses, and they would pick out the nicest thing for her. She even had her underwear brought from the plunder of the slave laborers, the enslaved inmates, and from murdered deportees. What a staggering disconnect to be so anti-Semitic and yet very happy to take things. And she was not alone. This was not unique to her. And as I said, the whole house was just a monument to theft. But the plunder grew so much as day after day, more and more transports arrived, that the Nazis opened a second complex of plunder warehouses in Birkenau, in the large Birkenau complex. I should tell you, by the way, that these poor dressmakers, a lot of them worked on hard labor constructing the new camp and even constructing the new gas chambers. Very brutal work. The death rates were very high, disease, of course, and despair. And Irina was one of those who was truly despairing, because while she was working in one of the Canada warehouses, the plunder warehouses, she came across clothing of one of her sisters who'd been murdered. And it wasn't so long afterwards that two more of her sisters who were in the camp with her died. One died of typhus and one was simply selected for the gas and murdered. And so Irina was absolutely in despair. And here comes Bracha. Bracha was, against the odds, an optimist. Bracha said, you are not going to give up. You are going to drag yourself out of the bunk. You are going to work. You are going to live. And Irina said, what's the point? The only way out is going to be through the chimneys. And Bracha said, no, we are going to get out and we are going to live and we are going to tell our story. She said, we're going to get out and have coffee and cake in Bratislava again. Well, Irina didn't believe her, but she kept going. She kept dragging herself to work in the plunder warehouses. And then entering the warehouses one day is Marta. Marta Fuchs, the very clever, compassionate dressmaker. And Marta had been picked to work in the Höss villa for the commandant's wife. And here she'd begun sewing for Hedwig. And her sewing was so good. Hedwig loved everything Marta made. And Marta wasn't just getting a cushy job to save her own life. It was really important where possible for prisoners to get more privileged positions, because then they could use their privilege to help others. And this is exactly what Marta did. She was also part of the underground network, and you can read about it in the book. Many of the prisoners who were forced to work in the commandant's villa, they were actually the whole time looking very obedient and diligent and downtrodden. The whole time they were working for the underground, for the resistance. And Marta was a member of the resistance too. So you can read about that. But in terms of the dressmakers, what's significant for them is that Marta used her position to keep saving another life and another life from the hell of hard labor and Auschwitz-Birkenau. And so she would say, oh, there's too much sewing. We have to get help. And Hedwig would say, right, you can have another prisoner. And then Marta would say, oh, I know someone who's really good at knitting. She'll knit clothes for the children, save another prisoner. And eventually the other SS wives got so jealous of Hedwig's beautiful wardrobe that Hedwig was forced to set up a complete dressmaking salon, an elite fashion salon, which was called the Upper Tailoring Studio. And it was set up in the SS administration block. And the administration block had 300 prisoners, roughly, mainly female inmates. And they worked as secretaries and filing clerks and typists and translators. There was also a beautician for the SS and massage room and hairdressers. There was a laundry room for SS laundry and a mending room. And there was the Upper Tailoring Studio. And Marta was made capo, or head of the studio. And many capos became synonymous with violence, with brutality, as they abused their position of power, traumatized by their own condition in Auschwitz. But Marta used her position to continue resistance work and to continue saving lives. So she saved her cousin Herta, and Herta Fuchs was a corsetier. And I'm pleased to tell you, Herta survived. And she was able to come to America. After the war, she came to America, and I believe her daughter now teaches in California. Marta then got her friend Irina into the workshop, saving Irina from despair, from suicide, because Irina could come to this relative haven of the workshop where they were allowed clean clothes, they were allowed to wash, and they had immense camaraderie. The work gave them meaning to their day, and it rehumanized them. They were with friends. Irina said, well, I've got a friend called Bracha. And Marta said, right, let's see if we can get her in. So she used her connections, and Bracha was called to the workshop. And Bracha says, well, I've got a sister, Katka. She's very frail, but she's very good at tailoring. And Katka came to the workshop as a specialist in coats, and it went from there. And eventually there were connections that brought Hunya into the workshop. And the other dressmakers called her Old Woman because she was 35 years old, which was very old for them. So to imagine what it might have been like in the workshop, I mean, of course I asked Bracha. I asked her what it was like, and she was able to give a description of the work. But other dressmakers who survived and left their testimonies with Dr. Laura Shelley, they also described something of the details. And we know that each dressmaker had to make at least 2 outfits a week, that the SS men would come and pick them up on Saturday. And you have to think, what was it like to be sewing for the very people who are endeavoring to destroy you, to brutalize you, to dehumanize you, the people who've already murdered your family and your friends and your school friends, and yet you're surrounded by beautiful fabrics. There are sewing machines whirring, there are dressmaking magazines. I've got a couple of examples here. And all of everything in the salon was taken from plunder. It was all stolen. And so the SS women used to look through fashion magazines. I have this one here, Die Mode, it's just fashion. And it's actually a National Socialist linked magazine. And you will look through, let's find you a nice fashion for coats there. Something Katka could make maybe. And you pick out, as the client, you pick out a style you want. And then Marta was a very talented cutter, which meant she could transform anything into a pattern. Dressmaking magazines eventually fold in Germany and in German-occupied territories. In 1943, they stopped producing them because they've run out of paper. The war economy means that there's no spare at all. But I have, where did I pop it? Oh, here. I do have a dressmaking pattern. This is the Frauenwarte. It's one of the magazines of the women's organization. And it has lots of tips on how to feed your family on very little, how to mend clothes, and also adverts on the back for sewing notions like elastic and sewing yarns and so on, and tape measures. So within it is a dressmaking pattern. And I'm showing it to you because I think the materiality of my job is one of the things that really resonates for me. To hold documents like this, you feel the paper, you flick through the pages of magazines, and it helps you make a connection. So here, if you can see, it's one sheet of tissue paper, and there are approximately 20 garments that you can make. And every single pattern piece, so imagine all the pattern pieces on this blouse, every single pattern piece is overlaid on this just one sheet of paper. So that's my small way of saying never underestimate the skill of dressmaking and tailoring. It's never just sewing. And particularly for these young women in the dressmaking salon, their sewing skills, they hope, will save their lives. And to give you an idea of the kind of clothes they might have, this is not from Auschwitz. I did contact the museum to ask about, as I said, ask about documents of the Upper Tailoring Studio. And to their knowledge, no documents survive. And to my knowledge, no garments. We don't know any garments that have provenance in the salon. I mean, how would you know? They certainly didn't put labels in saying made in Auschwitz. But we do know that Marta kept a black order book for clients in Berlin. And Hunya said that the very highest names in Berlin featured in this book. The book is lost, and Marta never told which names were in the book. But I'll show you this gown. It's a 1940s evening gown in chartreuse crepe with glittering sequins and embellishments. And I show it to you really to evoke the very deliberate contrast that the SS made between the privileged elite, the superhumans as they thought of themselves, and the degraded, subhuman prisoners. But for all the SS women thought that they were elegant and superior, the women in the dressmaking salon never lost their humanity. And you can read in the book of so many cases of resistance and even sabotage and wonderful acts of kindness. And I think those acts of quiet heroism are so powerful. And particularly since none of the SS clients really had an idea of just what the women thought of them and just what they were doing behind the scenes. So those women who survived to evacuation, you can read about how they were evacuated, you can read about escape attempts, and you can read, for the lucky ones, of their liberation eventually. And you already know now that Bracha survives. I'll leave you guessing about the other young women. But I'm pleased to tell you that there are many reunions after the war, although, of course, the terrible trauma of coming home and finding that you've survived, but your entire family is lost, has been murdered. And so restarting again, rehumanizing yourself after the war must have been such a harrowing experience. And yet they were young and they had skills. And one of the first things that the surviving dressmakers did was get hold of a sewing machine and start sewing again. But this time, not to save their lives, but for their livelihood. And eventually, those who married were able to sew for their families and pass on their love of sewing to the next generations. And some survivors passed on their stories. And so I had the great good fortune, as you now know, of speaking with Bracha in San Francisco and to hear her story, but also then to trace the testimonies of other survivors, and then also to piece together stories about those who didn't survive. And there's still more to know. COVID put paid to some archive visits, and I think it may be possible to track down more stories. There's always more to know, isn't there? So I'll show you one more garment before I open up, and I hope you've got some questions for me, because it's such an interesting topic from a very historical and economical point of view to try and understand the mentality of Nazi policies, but also from a human point of view, looking at that balance between hope and despair of different women and how people survived. And certainly those who contributed to Dr. Laura Shelley's questionnaires, which I mentioned at the beginning, amongst these was Hunya. Hunya does survive. I have to tell you this because I'm going to show you one of Hunya's garments next. Hunya completed Dr. Laura Shelley's questionnaire. And amongst the questions was, to what do you attribute your survival? And examples were given of faith, which was overwhelmingly the answer that most respondents checked, look, and of course, luck featured. It doesn't matter how resilient you are or how skilled you are, luck matters. And Bracha did say, she said there were thousands of dressmakers. In fact, I know of one woman who had worked for Chanel in Paris, thousands of dressmakers in Birkenau. But if you didn't have luck, you didn't have any connections, that was it. So these women were lucky. So faith and luck. Friendship. Overwhelmingly, the respondent says the power of friendship was what enabled them to keep going, to have that hope. And so these women are a remarkable example of friendship and loyalty and camaraderie, as you can read in the book. And then Hunya wrote, on top of on top of luck and friendship, she wrote a good capo, so that's martyr, and sewing skills. And after the war, Hunya made it to Israel, to Tel Aviv, and she carried on sewing for some very prestigious names in Tel Aviv. She had an apartment near the boardwalk, which I went to visit, actually. Hunya was sadly long dead, but just to go and visit this place where Hunya had sat and stitched. And Hunya, post-war, as she was sewing, she sometimes had visits from her young nieces. And one niece, Gila, said, "Aunt Hunya, tell me stories about your life." So as Hunya sits and sews, Gila sat and wrote. And she wrote her aunt's memoirs, which are an extraordinary read. They really are remarkable. And I have here something that Gila sent. So if I can just fetch it in. So here is a suit. Now, it never looks brilliant on Zoom, but it's super smart when you see it for real. It was stitched by Hunya and made out of one of her dresses into a suit. And it's a two-piece. It's got amazing pleating. The camera probably won't pick it up. And it's really smart cut, very zinging modern fabric. So this is mid-1950s. And what I love about it is, this is stitched by a woman, by Hunya, she is, who'd been enslaved, who had been treated as dirt under a boot, as one expression goes, in Auschwitz. And yet she had kept her defiance the whole time, she kept her humanity. And so she'd sewed for the SS in Auschwitz, but after the war, she sewed for her own living and her dignity, but she sewed for her family. She sewed out of love. And this suit is a testament to that, to Hunya's sewing skills. And so if you didn't know any better, you'd just think, oh, silk suit, vintage. But clothes always tell stories. We don't always know what the stories are, but we certainly can appreciate that this is a very special garment. And it's worth remembering, whatever clothes you're wearing, just sparing a thought for the talent that's gone into that. Who made it? Where were they? What was their life like? So I hope I've impressed upon you why I think clothing is such an interesting topic, how it gives us insights into past lives, into family stories, and so on. And I'm just going to give you one more little anecdote to finish. And if you have questions, that's marvelous. And I have got a reading from the book. And this is another anecdote from Braca, who I went to visit in San Francisco. And there were so many things I wanted to know. I went armed with a list of questions. I felt I was continuing Dr. Shelley's work in saying, right, it's never too late for people to remember. It's so important to have all of these stories and memories collected and shared, and for them to be as widely known as possible. And so I had all of these questions ready to ask Braca. And yet, one of the first things she said to me was, "You listen." Okay, so I sat and listened and wrote things down, shorthand notes. And it was very much a question of humility for me as a historian to listen to what Braca wanted to tell me. And she very much spoke of her family, of her lost loved ones, of those who'd been murdered. And she spoke of the friendship and the camaraderie. She spoke of Marta. She said everybody loved Marta. And I said, do you remember Hunya? Do you remember Hunya? She said, oh, I liked Hunya, she said. And then I asked her about Hedwig Höss. And of course, in histories of the Third Reich, the SS elite or the Wehrmacht, whoever, they often take center stage. There's so many books written about Hitler, about Hitler's cronies, about his policies. And yes, I have written a great deal about the SS women in my book. I think it's really important to understand what they knew, what they didn't know. They knew. And to understand their motivation for this plunder and this cruelty and dehumanization. But I was intrigued, these women had such an intimate relationship with the SS. What was Braca's opinion of Hedwig Höss, commandant's wife? And Braca's reply really put her in her place. I said, what was she like, Hedwig Höss? And Bereka thought for a moment, and she said, she'd had 4 children. Her figure wasn't so good. That was it. So it was a very timely reminder for me to remember that history is about people, but that I wanted to center it on the talent and the camaraderie and the resilience of these young dressmakers. And Hunya perhaps summed it up best. She said, we were like a family, united in joy and sorrow.